Picking up immediately where the previous video installation had left off at, as it was now 7 a.m., both the Combat Engineer Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade and the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade were conducting their sweep into the heart of Beaumont to capture their critical chief objectives, as the Combat Engineer Battalion was tasked with leaving State Highway 96 on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, which would take them straight into their objectives in the Neches River Port area, which consisted of the port itself and its critical energy resources, the installation of the 842nd Transportation Battalion, and the installation of the 596 Transport Group, plus the actual headquarters building of the entire U.S. Military Sea Lift Command. These were critically important objectives and were tasked out to the Combat Engineer Battalion to capture as they swiftly moved into the area by 7 a.m. Several miles west, the lead elements of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion were likewise moving into place, as they had taken 4th Street from State Highway 93, which would take them straight into their objective, which was the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve Site, which was the home of the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion. The total complement of defending military forces in the city of Beaumont exceeded 2,000 personnel, as these, effectively being non-combat troops, were still armed with military-grade weaponry, including their heaviest weapons being their crew-serve weapons, which were M250 cals and Mark 19 belt-fed grenade launching systems. These could be absolutely devastating to certain vehicle types or to dismounted infantry-type forces, although the firepower that would be vectored against the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve Site would be excessive and severe, as 105mm rifled tank guns aboard the two ZBD-05 assault gun/light tank companies would rain down absolute hell on all targets that they acquired, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system monitored the battlefield at all times through the massive ISR apparatus of the vehicle crew/dismounted squad-level quadcopter assets, the high-altitude drone assets, and above that, even satellite, to effectively acquire targets and send down strike packages to all vehicles and systems within the invasion coalition forces. This even included the assault gun/light tanks, as well as also the firing battery that was allocated from the artillery battalion to support the operations against the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve Site with their 8 howitzers, the PLZ-07 self-propelled guns. These would also rain down enormous destruction in conjunction with the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion's 82mm self-propelled mortar systems, and, of course, again, the rifled tank guns aboard the ZBD-05 assault gun/light tanks. As they moved into place, the two assault gun/light tank companies broke up and went different street directions, with one taking 4th Street, or continuing on 4th Street, towards their main objective, which would be Fannin Street, which was to the north of the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve installation, as they would establish fields of fire that would envelop the forces on the installation, preventing them from escaping, at least on overland routes where they could be seen and easily destroyed by these vehicles and other systems, including the firing battery with their 8 PLZ-07 self-propelled howitzers, as well as also the drones that would be employed in this operation, as the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade had new weaponry it wanted to try out in the form of their GJ-11 strike drones, each one capable of carrying an impressive payload for a drone, which was 4,000 pounds of precision air-to-ground munitions, as these two strike drones could take off from the deck of the Type 75 helicopter landing dock, or amphibious assault ship, if you will, and conduct these strikes. As aboard the Type 75 assault ship or landing dock, they had a total of 16 1,000-pound precision munitions to utilize for these drones, which meant that they could carry out 2 strikes using both drones, as each could carry 4,000 pounds, and a total of 8,000 would be dropped in one strike between both drones. There would be another set of munitions for a single reload for further strikes. However, for the time, these would be utilized to pummel defending forces on the installation. As before, on this map, as we go to the map here of the area, before the leading companies of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion even arrived into the area by between 7 and 7:05, with this Heavy Amphibious Marine Infantry Company moving in with its combat platoons and its headquarters platoon following behind to command the operation and provide ammunition and other logistical support to the forward fighting platoons. The arriving forces would move to surround the installation while airstrikes were being conducted by J-10 fighter aircraft that still had remaining air-to-ground munitions aboard, as again, for at least the opening of the entire nationwide invasion, in this particular invasion sector, in the Beaumont Port Arthur invasion sector, the J-10 fighter aircraft that were allocated to this battle space were mainly there to conduct air superiority operations and defend the airspace over the battlefield, while the Su-34 strike aircraft squadron from the Russian VVS, or Russian Air Force, was there to conduct strikes and close air support operations. However, the J-10 fighter aircraft, each one carrying a single pair of laser-guided 1,000-pound precision munitions, could also conduct airstrikes. And now that these aircraft were preparing to conduct an RTB, or a return to base, they were dropping the rest of their payloads on acquired targets that they received through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. As we go to the map of the area, the Karl Pipkin Army Reserve site at this point was in absolute total chaos, as preliminary artillery fire had come in to where overflow tents and an overflow motor pool had been set up on the grounds, and the initial artillery strikes that had come in after 5 a.m., as the artillery battalion had been fully offloaded by then, were now striking this area where the tents had been, and had completely destroyed tents and some of the vehicles in the motor pool, causing the rest of the vehicles to scatter. As in this particular area, there were the forces of the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion, which was its headquarters and headquarters company, its 103rd Quartermaster Company, 242nd Quartermaster Company, 1002nd Quartermaster Company, and the 310th Quartermaster Detachment, or what was left of them, as again, they had put together a scratch force for a reconnaissance operation, which had absolutely failed, and then the rescue force, which was larger, a company-sized force that they got a platoon from each of the comprising companies, had been sent out and destroyed. And when their preliminary artillery strikes had come in on their overflow area from a single firing battery that was allocated to support this operation, the 8 total 122mm PLZ-07 howitzers rained down repeated shell strikes into this area before the ground forces had arrived of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion to conduct their operation to capture this facility and clear it of all defending forces. As the Karl Pipkin Army Reserve site was seen as relatively important due to its massive maintenance bay facility, which was left intact, as well as its administrative building, which was also left intact, it was decided, much like the other units that were in question, to try to capture the commander and his XO and the rest of his command echelon in the administrative building, as the 842nd Transportation Battalion and the 596 Transport Group, and also, most important of all, the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command Headquarters, were all in the process of attempting to not just clear them, but capture their leadership for their high intelligence value. As the lieutenant colonel and major in overall command of the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion, in terms of intelligence value, were not as great as the command echelon of the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command. They were still seen as somewhat important and were desired to be taken alive if possible. And as they now stormed this area. They also wanted the sergeant major over the entire battalion as well. As they moved into the area, they now begun to rain down their shell fires. As in this area, a grouping of M113 armored personnel carriers, a platoon, had left out the back of the facility into Central Park, which was just off the map, and had come around to 4th Street, and were trying to move into the area to reinforce a squad that they had positioned in this empty lot through which the rails had run through, as this railhead right here belonged to the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve site. Key buildings on the installation had already been annihilated by 2 tactical ballistic missile strikes, one DF-11A and one DF-15B, which landed in this area and destroyed an important communications building, as well as also warehouse and storage buildings on site, which had annihilated much of the ammunition required for this entire battalion, although they still had ammunition in their vehicles and on their person. The rest of their ammunition supply would have been exhausted had this been a prolonged battle. There was a grouping of vehicles, as this was a scratch force put together below this incoming airstrike from 4 J-10 fighter aircraft, trying desperately to race from the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve site to the port area to spread word that they were now under attack, as these vehicles had pulled in and begun to lay down fire into the area, firing 30mm autocannon fire, 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire from the IFVs of the Amphibious Heavy Marine Infantry Company from the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as well as also the 105mm shell fire now coming in from these assault gun / light tanks, the ZBDO-5s of both companies, as one company was moving north to the west of the facility and another moving north to the east of the facility, continuing down 4th Street. This combat platoon of heavy amphibious marine infantry moving into the area would dismount all of their squads to lay down fire, with the vehicles orienting all of their fire towards the facility, while this platoon would roll in a single column formation of vehicles, with this squad having cleared this building and this rolling T formation clearing this building and then taking position on the roof for overwatch over their vehicles of their platoon. This squad that had cleared this building continued alongside of their platoon vehicles as they pulled up to the railhead, and they would lay down fire just as this GJ-11 strike drone came in and dropped 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions in this area, completely annihilating the defenders with this heavy blow of munitions, as the defending forces were trying to take up positions anywhere they could, including in drainage ditches, which were used as trenches, and were laying down fire with their M249 squad automatic weapons, their light machine guns, their rifle fire from their M16A2s, as well as those that had 40mm grenade tubes beneath their rifles, firing those as well. It was a desperate fight. Some were even trying to use crew-serve weapons, such as this M2 50 cal machine gun aboard this MRAP, which is in the process of being shredded through by 30mm autocannon HE armor-piercing ammunition, as this vehicle, this LMTV truck with its shredded up truck bed and broken axles and ripped off door, have been literally thrown and flipped into this area where it landed and broke off its wheels. It had been heavily destroyed by all the landing 82mm mortar fires, as well as 122mm shell fires were now landing through the area at the same time as the incoming 30mm autocannon fire was shredding through these vehicles like a hot knife through butter, as well as also potent shell fire coming from the assault gun / light tanks with their staggered weapons rolling up these streets, as this company was moving through this area where the fence line here is, and these trenches, which were actually drainage ditches, these were inhabited by troops trying to lay down fire. This platoon of M113 armor personnel carriers was coming out at the same time, while this platoon rode across the tracks in a single column formation, lay down fire with the staggered weapons of this company laying down tank shell fire into them at the same time as 30mm and 12.7mm fire was exchanged into them from the vehicles. This squad along the tracks had already since moved into this building with this wedge formation, And this squad right behind it, 2 squads moving into place here, where the squads tactically bounded and covered to clear this building that had a squad of defenders in it trying to fire out of it at these forces. The PLAN Marines, chiefly their dismounts, would take some moderate casualties in this battle, even though they were up against non-combat troops, because the non-combat troops were fighting fanatically with everything they had, which included not just their weapons while they were dismounted, but they were also fighting with their vehicle-based crew-serve weapons, which included M250 cals, Mark 19 belt-fed grenade launchers, and also general purpose machine guns like the 240 Bravo, which fired the 7.62 NATO round, or 7.62 by 51, which was lighter, of course, than the M250 cal, but it was still a potent weapon. But the light machine gun fire and rifle fire was most of what was being utilized against the attacking forces, and it was failing miserably as a result, as the fire being vectored upon them was far heavier, coming from the infantry fighting vehicles, and of course the assault guns / light tanks, which were absolutely devastating beyond all imagination with their rifled 105mm tank shell fires, as they had different shell choices and options they could utilize in these vehicles. They were very destructive weapons of war, and also the artillery support coming from a single firing battery, as there were 4 of 7 firing batteries of the artillery battalion that were allocated to the operations going on in Beaumont, with the other 3 allocated to the operations in Vidor, as the 2 batteries of the 4 allocated to Beaumont were firing on the port areas, the installations along the port, the 842nd Transportation Battalion site, as well as also the 596 Transport Group site. One of the 4 firing batteries was firing in support of the battle occurring in the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve site, with the last firing battery of 4 supporting the 2 air assault infantry marine companies that were holding the vital I-10 bridge in the southwest of the city, as they were now being gradually assaulted by small groups of militia personnel of armed reactionary civilian elements that were trying to assault them repeatedly in this area, as it was under heavy attack at many different times. The real-time AI battlefield data processing system was constantly putting together artillery strike packages for use against these militia forces every time they attacked. The 8 howitzers of 1 firing battery allocated to supporting those forces was constantly laying down their devastating 122mm shell fire support, as the air power by 9 a.m., no later than, would be conducting their RTB, or their return to base, which included the 2 PLAAF, or Chinese Air Force J-10 fighter squadrons, as well as also the single Russian Su-34 squadron from the Russian VVS, or Air Force. They would jettison the last of their payloads on emerging threats, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system directed them to, as the air superiority operations were effectively over, long since over by this point, as the USAF ceased to exist, nor did the U.S. Naval Aviation or Marine Corps Aviation on the mainland, as it was all wiped out in the opening assault as the invasion commenced. And now the fighter aircraft could conduct their RTB to rearm and re-equip with predominantly air-to-ground munitions instead of air-to-air munitions, which they were currently equipped with, as they would trade in their PL-15, PL-17, and PL-12 missiles for mostly 1,000-pound precision munitions, as they would only come back with a single pair of PL-12 air-to-air missiles on each wingtip as per SOP for self-defense, although it was not required again at this point, as there was no longer any air threats, but it was done as a matter of SOP. As the Russian aircraft, of course, very heavily laden down with air-to-ground munitions, would likewise re-equip with more munitions and return to conduct more strikes and close air support operations along with the PLAAF, as now the 2 Su-34 strike aircraft flying through this battle space at the opening of this map had already jettisoned a sizable payload on a grouping of armed reactionary civilians that were just off this map and were seen as a threat. They had been totally obliterated by the remaining air-to-ground munitions that were dropped on that part of the city, simply crippling the area and destroying the threat, as now the grouping that was trying to establish communications, having had left the Karl Pipkin Army Reserve site and moving down the street, would be hit with 8,000 total pounds of air-to-ground munitions from the 4 J-10 fighter aircraft, as each, again, at this point in time, had a single pair of laser-guided precision munitions. They were directed to drop it on this area, and they smashed this entire vehicle column of Max Pro MRAPs, LMTV trucks, a fuel truck, an M88 armored recovery vehicle, and an up-armored Humvee below this aircraft, simply smashing them into pieces, as well as this group of troops in a wedge formation trying to bound to this building, but it was too late as they were smashed in the airstrike. These 2 squads, belonging to a platoon in this company of assault guns/light tanks, had been dispatched to clear the flanks of their advance, and they folded into a line formation here, and half squad would go first and the other half squad would bound behind them as they could lay down fire support to allow for this squad to advance. But there was no need, as there was no threats in this building. As at the opening of the map, fire was being exchanged by this squad into half squads with intersecting fields of fire against this grouping, this squad coming out of this gutted building, trying to cross the street, but running into these troops instead, cutting them down. As the airstrike then commenced and destroyed all these forces, they would continue moving through the devastated area after they would pause and wait for this airstrike to commence, as this squad would then continue bounding in 2 half squads to the rails. By the time they would arrive, surgical 82mm mortar strikes would land in and around this trench, having had been dug in this empty lot with trees in it, this empty wooded lot through which this rail network traversed, and they would be hit mercilessly by 82mm mortar strikes, while this grouping, again, was destroyed by the shells from the rifled tank guns aboard the ZBD-05 assault gun/light tank company, moving up 4th Street in this area as they had advanced at first through quasi-rural and suburban areas. Now that they were in the heart of the city, gutted buildings from punishing airstrikes and artillery strikes and devastated vehicles littered the streets, but these vehicles could push them aside with impunity as they fired their devastating tank shells at their given targets. As they moved into the area, the combat engineer company that was part of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as they had their own combat engineer company within their battalion, would be dispatched to capture another objective, which they would take without a fight, as it was unoccupied at the time. They would roll into the Beaumont Municipal Airport, which would be converted into either a forward operating base or a combat outpost, as they would take College Street, or State Highway 90, which was effectively the street right here, College Street, which became State Highway 90, all the way out to the airport, which they would do after this battle had concluded. For the time being, only 3 of the 8 companies of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion were involved in this devastating assault, as at the opening, the headquarters platoon of the Heavy Amphibious Marine Infantry Company had 2 specialized drone operators in their headquarters platoon that fired the single-tube version of the CH-901A loitering munitions, as these loitering munitions would be equipped with HE warhead payloads. They would strike key targets such as this grouping of 15 armed reactionary civilians on the roof of the parking garage of this hospital as they had moved into this area and taken position on the roof. They were trying to fire down at the light tank/assault guns, whose turret gunners returned fire with their 12.7mm heavy machine guns, but also would now be hit by a surgical, devastating strike from an HE warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munition. As these 2 GJ-11 strike drones came in, which looked like miniature stealth bombers, having taken off from the Type 075 helicopter landing dock belonging to the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, which was out at sea. By the time they moved in and dropped their devastating payloads at the same time as artillery and mortar strikes were coming in, they had destroyed this Atlas tow motor, these armored ambulances, these M113 ambulances, these chemical vehicles, which belong to the chemical troops of the 373rd, and all of these MRAPs that were guarding the perimeter were simply smashed and destroyed, along with groupings of troops that were out in this area, as this area had already been hit multiple times by 122mm shell fire before the arrival of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as that was where the overflow tents and overflow motor pool was situated. Many vehicles already being destroyed, causing others to scatter, but they too were now in the process of being eliminated, including with the strikes coming in from some of the CH-901A loitering munitions that were fired, while the other one hit this grouping of armed reactionary civilians trying to fire at this column of this company of ZBDO-5 assault gun / light tanks rolling up the street. As they had dispatched 2 squads already to clear the flanks of their advance through these buildings, they moved into the hospital at the opening as these vehicles moved up and were taking some fire before the strike came in, and they were returning fire with their potent 105mm tank guns aboard the ZBDO-5s. As 2 squads from 1 platoon had already entered the hospital through this direction, another would enter through the emergency room, and the last 2 squads of the same platoon would enter the parking garage and clear this entire facility while the column moved forward towards their ultimate objective, which was Fannin Street, where they could have fields of fire that would totally envelop this facility and prevent any sort of escape. The panic was ongoing in the facility as vehicles were still constantly on the move amid all the shell and mortar strikes that were now coming in, including 105mm rifle tank gun strikes that destroyed these vehicles one by one as the staggered weapons on this column were letting loose against targets in the facility. They were also being hit at the same time by artillery and mortar strikes. It was absolutely savage. As this column was destroyed by this single lead light tank / assault gun firing its shells, ripping through this column. The mortars eliminated these forces. This half squad bounded forward, then this half squad bounded, then this half squad bounded, and the whole squad took position on the rails to lay down fire, by which time the 30mm autocannon fire, along with mortar strikes, had ripped through these Max Pro MRAPs and destroyed this building, as these squads, all 5, had dismounted from their vehicles. They had taken some fire, and there were casualties among this platoon, but the casualties were relatively light among that platoon, but there would be heavier casualties when the buildings themselves would be cleared, as the fighting in this area was absolutely savage and destructive in every facet of the imagination. The vehicles lay on fire or completely crippled and smoking as they were ripped to shreds by the combination of the tank shell fire from the 105mm tank guns aboard the ZBDO-5 assault gun / light tanks of those companies, as well as also the incoming mortar strikes from the 82mm mortar fire, and also artillery strikes, which were even more powerful, that came in from the PLZ-07 122mm self-propelled howitzers. As a single firing battery, one of the 4 allocated to Beaumont was avidly supporting the operations now occurring here, as they were constantly getting strike packages through their FDCs in each firing platoon, which were being passed down to both gun lines, as each platoon had 4 howitzers of their battery, and were now laying down massive fire and also destroying the remaining fuel trucks, LMTVs and HETs, and 2 armored recovery vehicles in this motor pool, which was a sizable motor pool. At the time of the opening of this assault, there were already fire engines trying to put out the fires desperately that had been started both by the Chi-Com MSS agents planting demolition charges along with their allies, the ISI intelligence agents, and also Iranian Ministry of Intelligence agents as well, along with the Pakistanis and Chinese, having had planted demolition charges, blasting vehicles and causing fires, which these fire engines were trying to put out at the opening of the invasion, while this smoking, cratered area, which once had warehouses and a main communications building, were absolutely annihilated by the tactical ballistic missile strikes from a DF-11A and DF-15B, which caused a massive crater in this area and devastated rubble all around it. Follow-up cruise missile strikes even came in and caused fires, as a gas main had been effectively destroyed and went aflame in the rubble, and these fire trucks were trying to put it out at the time, while there were also fires in this motor pool before the shells came in and finished off these vehicles, as the shells raked up and down from the 8 howitzers in these areas. One grouping of shells from 2 howitzers hit this area, destroying an up-armored Humvee, while the others went around it. Another would be destroyed by another shell here, leaving only 2 to come around, one with a Mark 19 and the other with a 50 cal, to try to lay down fire on this platoon, having it rolled into the area, along with this platoon taking up position along the embankment, and this platoon laying down fire to support the advance of these 2 platoons as they were to take the facility, as all of this heavy firepower was absolutely destructive beyond all words. the GJ-11 strike drones causing enormous damage along the perimeters with their heavy 4,000-pound payloads of air-to-ground munitions now would return to the Type 75 landing dock to be reloaded, as they had enough munitions at least aboard that ship for one more reload without the supply ship bringing more. As now these platoons were laying down fire against the building, these two squads would remount in their vehicles and would continue through and into the facility to clear the main administrative building. All of the fighting that had been occurring outside of these buildings had lasted approximately 2 hours. It would last from 7 a.m. to about 9 a.m. as this whole platoon would clear the hospital. The rest of the vehicles of the 4 combat platoons and headquarters platoon would continue on in their column, as would this column moving past the wreckage of these M113 armor personnel carriers and the corpses of this destroyed squad in this trench that they had dug as a defensive position by these trees and by the rail line. This whole area was completely annihilated by the munitions dropped by the 4 J-10 fighter aircraft, jettisoning their 2,000-pound payloads each on targets below, and destroyed the whole column of vehicles that was supposed to be a messenger column, as they were to spread messages, as again, they needed runners, as all of their communications technology was effectively nil. They had none. It was all wiped out with the tandem anti-satellite cyber strike and the use of electronic warfare assets in the area. Was the Su-34 strike aircraft, 2 of which passing over the area, this pair having had also jettisoned their payload just off-map, hitting a grouping of armed civilian militia-type elements that were deemed as a threat. These platoons, now having had moved into this area, were preparing their assault, as this platoon, having had assisted in destroying this platoon of M113s with 30mm autocannon fire into their sides, as well as 12.7mm fire from their IFVs, as they had these weapons aboard. The tank shell fire vectored into them across the parking lot was also devastating. Very well executed in a tactical manner, absolutely shredded these vehicles to pieces before they could even dismount their squads, as they captured this building, and there was a squad on the roof of this building laying down fire into the area. Mortar strike would come in and destroy this squad of personnel by the motor pool, as this tow motor would try to escape through the area and end up being hit by artillery strikes. All of this was absolutely devastating, as well as the fire being meted out by the vehicles and dismounted troops who now remounted up into their vehicles to move in to the facility, as by 9 a.m., the aircraft had all left the battle space to conduct their RTB, to refuel, rearm, and conduct any badly needed maintenance, leaving effectively just the artillery to support the operations now going on, along with their own built-in 82mm mortar company and the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion as well. And of course, their assault gun/light tanks were more than enough in terms of firepower superiority to lay down massive destruction and devastation throughout this battle space. As they moved in, the 2 infantry platoons of heavy marine amphibious infantry, the other one would move in through this direction after these forces had all been annihilated on the installation. They would smash through what little bit of fencing even remained and make their way into the facility with all of the twisted hulks of metal that were spread about the area, some on fire, most of them smoking from all of the munitions they've handled, as munitions shredded through vehicles and threw them around as if they weighed nothing. The defenders in the trenches were all but wiped out at this point, and the PLAN Marines prepared to enter the facility and plant their national flag of China and their party flag of the CCP regime on top of the captured buildings as they moved in with their vehicles to capture the facility. The fighting for the buildings would be heavy, as they would storm the buildings and go through as stack teams and try at least to capture the command elements alive if possible. But again, they were not seen as important as the U.S. military Sealift command echelon, but if they could be taken alive, they would be. And there would be POWs netted from this overall operation, although most of the forces that had been fighting outside by this point will have been annihilated, as the combat outside was excessive and very heavy as the vehicles were taking enormous destruction, as mentioned, and the firepower meted out against them was far more than they could handle, as these non-combat troops were simply being annihilated bit by bit. As the PLAN Marines moved into the facility, they rolled in with 2 platoons and 1 platoon watching their flanks, as this other one had fields of fire watching their flanks, as the 2 assault gun / light tank companies rolled all the way forward to their ultimate objective, which was Fannin Street. And as they had staggered weapons and 360-degree security around their whole columns, they had fields of fire that dominated the Central Park, which was just off map and behind this facility to its north, and thus could destroy any personnel trying to flee out of the north of the facility. As by 9 a.m., as these platoons now rolled into the main motor pool behind the administrative building and the main maintenance and supply building here, which was also seen as important due to its maintenance bays, which could serve as useful for maintaining vehicles if this place would become a forward operating base or combat outpost for the occupation forces. The rest of it was outright annihilated, including with the missile strikes and the demo charges planted on vehicles in the motor pool by the agents that had gotten in. So the railhead was damaged. It could be relatively easy to repair, although the damage was extensive throughout the facility. It was largely done to the vehicles using artillery, mortars, and even munitions strikes with the heavy 4,000 pounds worth each on these GJ-11 strike drones of air-to-ground precision munitions, as well as also 105mm tank shell fire, which shredded through these vehicles at the same time as they're being hit by artillery and mortars. It was an absolute savagely destructive operation, as these 4 LMTVs had already moved around the building and tried to get their squads into the safety of the administration building, as they had seen that it was not being destroyed by artillery. They were constantly hit by repeated 82mm mortar strikes, which shredded the vehicles up and the crew members that got out. They were all wiped out. They didn't even make it into the building, although the administrative building would take some damage as the fire was exchanged between the troops in the building and the vehicles and the troops that were dismounted. 1 platoon dismounted 2 squads to provide mutual infantry and vehicle support to one another as they entered this motor pool area. All these vehicles by now destroyed. Fire trucks were even shredded up from crossfire. They were no longer working. These 2 were destroyed. And as this entire platoon would dismount to clear this building with 200 defenders inside of it, these squads would first send 3 in from this platoon, but then, as due to building clearance procedures, as vehicles and troops can wait outside to provide support or cut off escape from different exits, they would call in the other 2 squads to help clear this building, as there were many defenders inside. And this platoon would sit outside and provide support to this operation, along with the vehicles still outside from this platoon, as they had their gunners, drivers, and their platoon sergeant and platoon leader still mounted up. These squads breached the building while taking fire, and the vehicles would return fire into the building wherever enemy forces appeared at windows or other areas, such as holes that had been blown out by vehicle-based fires. As they entered and breached the building and begun to move through the building in stack team formations, they would get in some heavy combat inside of this building, and they would suffer casualties as it pertained to the PLAN Marines, as the American forces inside fought tenaciously and savagely for what they perceived as their lives, as they were indeed fighting for their lives. It was a hellish battle inside of this first administrative building, and it would take 2 hours to completely clear it and go through it due to the tenacity and savagery of the defense, as 50 troops of the platoon came up against 200 defenders that were inside. The fighting would be heavy as the PLAN Marine Heavy Infantry stormed the first building, as their vehicles sat outside waiting for them, as well as another platoon sitting in the motor pool to provide support if needed. After 2 hours, by 11 a.m., the admin building will have been fully cleared, with 20 prisoners taken of the 200, the rest having had fought to the very last, and they would be sent out and guarded by this platoon and the vehicles of this platoon, with the other full platoon of dismounts from this platoon here of vehicles having had cleared this building, preparing to storm the maintenance building, still holding out with 150 defenders who were exchanging fire with the vehicles outside. And now vehicles provide fire support with 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun fire to allow for this platoon, this entire platoon of 5 squads, to breach and clear this building of 120 defenders, which this operation would take yet another hour, as the capture of this entire facility lasted from 7 a.m. to noon. This battle would be over just barely before the capture to the east of the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command would be over with, as the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command building would be taken by 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site would fall by roughly noon, or an hour earlier, as the savage exchange of munitions into the vehicles on this facility and the destruction of the surrounding businesses in this area was absolutely devastating beyond all imagination. The Carl Pipkin Army Reserve site would eventually be used as a combat outpost for the occupation forces in the area, as they planted their flag on the last building, both their national flag and their party flag, which was a red banner bearing a sickle and hammer. The PLAN Marines, having had taken the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve site, were victorious and had a major victory in so doing, as they had now, along with the Combat Engineer Battalion operating several miles to the east, taken some of the most important objectives in this entire operation, as the port area itself was absolutely critical, as it was critical to American national security, as they deployed and redeployed troops from the 842nd and 596th installations, and it was also the headquarters of the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command. The combat engineers had also a massive victory in taking these areas. However, the fighting was not over yet, and there would be more to come, as even though these facilities fell, and even at 7 a.m., as the fighting at the port and at Carl R. Pipkin began, the other massively important objective, which was the Entergy Sabine power plant, which was lightly guarded by American Alphabet paramilitary forces, was taken by the Combat Engineer Company from the Light Combined Arms Battalion, with the rest of the battalion moving into the smaller city of Orange to capture the main objectives there, which was a key segment of I-10 with the Sabine River I-10 bridge, which was the gateway into the American Southeast, as well as also the entire I-10 segment through this node, which was the city of Orange. And, of course, they had to take the Entergy Sabine power plant headquarters building itself, which was also well defended, but was important for the operation of the plant, as the Combat Engineer Company from the Light Combined Arms Battalion moved in and taken the plant by 7 a.m. from 6 to 7. The rest of the battalion, moving in to seize Orange, had fought for hours in that city, just as the fighting was ongoing in Vidor, as all the operations were occurring in nearby Beaumont to the west. Vidor could potentially be a thorn in the side of the occupation forces, as the militia forces there were fighting relatively hard against the invasion forces, as generally outside of the city of Beaumont itself, there were a large number of small militia groups that had to be contended with, as these could potentially become some kind of partisan uprising against the occupation forces once the invasion had concluded. And even within the city of Beaumont itself, more combat would ensue against groupings of armed reactionary civilians that had been laying low and hiding in sewers, in maintenance tunnels, and basements, and other areas that were now beginning to emerge and constitute a threat to the occupation, as this entire node would need to be cleared in the form of the city of Beaumont, as it was a massive node through which the PLA Group armies of 16 through 20 had to pass through, as PLA Group Army 15 had been shed off in Houston to replace the 83rd PLA Group Army so that they could be relieved and move north into northeast Texas and occupy a new AO. The external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 16 through 20 still had to pass through Beaumont, which is a large node, and it was left to the responsibility of the PLAN Marine 6th brigade to capture and hold the entire area so that the external invasion prong could pass through unaffected, as the only time in the fourth generation warfare doctrines that the externals were to stop was to effectively resupply, stop for fuel, stop for food, stop for maintenance actions, and these were to be conducted with a massive level of rapidity never before seen in war, as it was the job of either other externals, as the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade was technically an external invasion force as it landed on the coast and didn't come from CCP properties like the forces in the nearby Houston AO. They were responsible for taking and holding this area so that the massive external invasion prong of the PLA group armies could pass through unaffected, as they had to move through this area of operations up I-10 through this major node, which is a big city, and then through the Vidor node, and then through Orange. And this whole area had to be absolutely locked down. There were small groups of renegade military personnel that had made it into other parts of the city and were in hiding, and were trying to help organize armed reactionary civilian bands, which would appear and would be shelled heavily by the artillery devoted to this area, which were the 4 howitzer batteries that covered the Beaumont area as the port operation had concluded and the operation to capture the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve Center concluded. These batteries could redevote their fire missions to other sectors inside of Beaumont now, and they would assist the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion as well as the Combat Engineer Battalion with capturing the rest of the city from the remaining resistance, as armed reactionary civilians were now rising up in these areas and were beginning to become a nuisance, and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system surveilling the entire area was guiding these forces on all of their moves, as in what areas to assault and how to go about it, angle and traverse of weapons, floor plans for taking certain buildings and key positions, and more. The real-time AI battlefield data processing system calculated all domains of data, making these coalition forces the most effective fighting force in the history of humankind as they moved through their various AOs throughout the land. In the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve site, now occupied by the company of PLAN Marine Heavy Amphibious Infantry, having had moved in from the city into this installation to capture it, they, again, having had planted their flags over their last remaining buildings on the facility, signified that this area was now under PLAN Marine control, and POWs had been captured among the defending forces. And there were many KIAs among the defending forces, and all of their vehicles were totally destroyed by the fighting as well. And the buildings that had been hit by missile strikes were also absolutely devastated beyond repair and would be effectively cleared out in terms of all the rubble, and they would use POW labor to do it. As now, the PLAN Marines would establish a perimeter and defend this area and would begin to convert it into a combat outpost of sorts, or perhaps a forward operating base, as determined by the command of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade. For the time being, this company would operate a defensive perimeter around the installation freshly captured, and the 2 light tank/assault gun companies could now redeploy against other targets in this area in the city, as the urban combat would go on for a number of hours, as all areas around I-10 had to be completely cleared of hostile forces. As in this illustration or animation, the building, having had been hit by heavy airstrikes or perhaps heavy artillery strikes, had collapsed and into the street. People were crushed alive, others buried beneath the rubble. Destroyed vehicles were everywhere, littering the streets, and abandoned vehicles. Innocent bystanders or non-combatants shredded to pieces from shrapnel ripping right through them from the destruction that abounded all around them. All of this absolutely terrifying and devastating for most of the population, who had never even fathomed that such a thing could even occur, and now they were facing it head on, and many were being destroyed in the wake of this devastation that now gripped the entirety of the Beaumont-Port Arthur battle space, as the artillery would redirect onto new targets. They would shatter the opposition of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as well as also the Combat Engineer Battalion, who would work to clear the rest of the city of enemy combatants, as there was another minor objective that needed to be taken, which was another sewage and water treatment plant just to the north of the I-10 segment leading out of the city to the east into Vidor by the I-10 Neches River Bridge. Combat engineers would assault this area with a single company and capture it and hold it, as it was important to the running of the new red zone, which would be established in the heart of Beaumont, as this would be colonized, and this would be a major military center, just as it was for the Americans, as they would deploy and redeploy their occupation forces from the rail and port network of the Neches River Port, as instead of American ships, it would be coalition ships moving in and out of this area with their units and supplies. As likely, the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve Site, along with the other installations, would all be reestablished as major installations, but for the time being, they would only be held as new combat outposts unless it was decided to build them up beyond a combat outpost status, such as a FOB or even a mega FOB. It would all be decided by the overall command of the entire invasion, as they had already planned for how they wanted to establish their new colony post-invasion. Many of the smaller units did not have access to this planning at this time, but they would be informed when the time came. In other parts of the Beaumont/Port Arthur battle space, as the Entergy Sabine power plant, which is absolutely critical to running the entirety of the city's power when it would be turned back on due to the tandem anti-Satin cyber strikes taking everything down. When the power would be restored, the occupation of this power plant would be absolutely critical to the running of operations in the city of Beaumont, which would be a major colonial city due to its rail and port infrastructure, which was critical to the coalition forces. As the fighting in Vidor, which included the Recon Battalion, was a ongoing battle that lasted much of the morning, the Medium Combined Arms Battalion, which moved into Vidor along with the Recon Battalion, would be critical in holding this particular area, as due to its proximity to the port facilities of Beaumont, the occupation of Vidor was absolutely critical to the coalition forces, and thus Vidor was to be held, as was the city of Orange, and completely cleared of any and all enemy combatants, as the fighting in the port fully was over by 1 p.m., as the headquarters building of the U.S. Military Sealift Command and its command elements would be taken alive. The combat engineers would prepare for their next major push, sending a company to capture and clear the water and sewage treatment plant just across I-10 to the north of the port area, as they needed to not just take that as a major objective, as it was important to the overall running of the city, as the water and sewage treatment plants, just like the power plant, was absolutely vital infrastructure to keep. They had to clear it of hostile forces as well, and they would do so avidly as they would move into the area, as the armed reactionary civilians would be putting up dogged resistance for a number of hours, and this time inside of the city of Beaumont, as even 500 militia personnel from just outside of Beaumont to the west, having had been trapped by the earlier cruise missile strikes on the bridges, would be sneaking through the woods and trying to enter Beaumont to assault the invasion forces, as they had received word that the fighting in Beaumont had become rather heavy, and this as a direct result of non-combatants fleeing the area and spreading word of all that they had seen, as they had fled the area ahead of the advance of the combat companies of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, and had fled out of the city to inform the militia forces and others of everything they had seen going on therein. And thus, they would try to conduct an assault against the PLAN Marines now holding the I-10 segment through the heart of the city. As I-10 and its surrounding areas needed to be cleared, the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion would be very busy with this new task, as they would be conducting these clearance operations, just as the Combat Engineer Battalion would be doing the same in their sector near the Neches River. Fighting would still be heavy, but the armed reactionary civilians would be relatively easier to contend with than were the over 2,000 military personnel that had been located throughout the heart of Beaumont. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines, the Combat Engineer Battalion again would conduct a heavy assault with a single combat company against 250 armed reactionary civilians, having had moved into the area and were now occupying the sewage and water treatment facility. They would clear and try to take the facilities as much intact as possible with their surgical capabilities, and also have artillery support when where necessary to eradicate these armed combatants. As they would gradually sweep through the north of the city, in the north of the downtown, the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, spreading out its companies and leaving one Heavy Marine Amphibious Infantry Company to occupy their recently captured gains, would guard I-10 as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system with high-altitude assets and quadcopter assets would see these militia personnel emerging from the woods just outside of the city and moving into the heart of the city, where they would try guerrilla warfare tactics against the assault gun / light tank companies and the additional 2 heavy marine amphibious infantry companies, as the 82 millimeter mortar company and the headquarters and support company over the entire battalion will by now have moved into the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve site, with the defending Heavy Marine Amphibious Infantry Company guarding the facility. So there would be 3 of the 8 companies in Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site, and the rest of the companies would be spread out to clear and hold I-10 in the heart of the city. As these militia forces would conduct their assault, they would be beaten back heavily with massive artillery strikes, as well as also later returning aircraft, as the Su-34 Squadron and the 2 J-10 squadrons would return after having had conducted their RTB for 4 hours' time, as the ground crews worked fast like race car pit crews to get these airframes airworthy again for their next missions. And they would return with a vengeance and would massacre many groupings of armed combatants that would emerge, along with the ground forces and their heavy artillery support, which now could cover this entire area with the range of their howitzers. And the fighting in the heart of the city would go on for a number of hours, because by 6 p.m., the arrival into this battle space of the PLA group armies, 16 through 20, would be unfolding. And just in the nick of time, as this operation was exceedingly time sensitive, all of the nodes en route would be fully cleared. Just in the nick of time, as the saying could be said, as by 6 p.m., the leading PLA group armies moving through the area in their massively miles-long convoy formation would be moving across the southwest I-10 bridge of the city, moving in through the heart of the city, and taking I-10 through Vidor and through the city of Orange, the gateway to the southeastern invasion sector, as the PLAN Marines tasked with these operations will by then have had full control over the urban areas. However, that being said, as they would have just barely accomplished their mission in time, there would still be other missions to follow on the second day. Beaumont in Port Arthur was, in fact, a 2-day-long battle, because the hinterlands with additional militia personnel had to be cleared. Even 50 surviving Marines from early on the first day had come together with 600 armed reactionary civilian militia in a swampy area to begin to conduct partisan operations, or at least that was the plan, as the surviving 50 Marines, having had encountered American militia personnel out in the hinterlands, would try to work together with them to create a type of cohesive partisan-like force to hit back against the invasion forces, as the U.S. Marines, some of which came from the weapons company, had ATGMs like javelins and other heavier weapons, as these were actual combat forces that had to be wiped out immediately by the PLAN, as they were seen as the only major threat in the area, as the rest of the forces were Army reservists and naval personnel and others that were non-combat troops. But these Marines were combat troops, and some of them had escaped the bivouac site where they were at with some of their heavy weapons. And these would definitely come in handy, as the saying goes, against the invasion forces, as the air assault troops of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade would be they who would be tasked with clearing the hinterlands of the partisan or insurgent or rebel forces that were now beginning to come together, as by day 2, this could not be allowed to stand, at least by the PLAN Marines, as they were seen as being a possible major threat, because it was well understood that of the 50 Marines that escaped, some did escape with heavy weapons, such as Javelin ATGMs, and these indeed could pose a threat for the occupation forces if these turned into a sort of guerrilla element along with the armed reactionary civilians and had begun to attack the occupation forces at different venues in this battle space. However, the air assault forces were the perfect force for this task, and they would indeed be deployed against the remaining U.S. military personnel in the form of the U.S. Marines and the armed reactionary civilians that were with them, and even some renegade Army personnel that had escaped before the battle had even really gotten underway for their facilities. They, too, would be hunted down by the PLAN Marines in battle, as the fighting, of course, was exceedingly heavy already, but it would continue for a number of hours and even into the next day, as the hinterlands would be cleared by the PLAN Marine Air Assault Battalion. They would take casualties in these operations, just as casualties have been taken trying to take the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site, as the entire remains of the battalion, which was once 750 strong, of the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion, had effectively only left 50 prisoners of war, as all the rest had been eradicated. The destruction on the PLAN Marine side was such to where they had suffered a total of 12 KIAs, and they had suffered 30 WIAs, but the WIAs were not severe. They could be effectively patched up and returned to duty for the most part, but the 12 KIAs would be effectively taken out to sea, as the Air Assault Battalion would utilize one of its Z-18 utility helos from the Transport Aviation Company within the Air Assault Battalion to pick up the KIAs from the heliport of the hospital and fly them back out to sea, where they could be stored in the onboard morgue on the ship. As the fighting, producing 12 PLAN Marine casualties, in the grand scheme of things, was light for the units that suffered the casualties, as in the platoons of the PLAN Marine Heavy Amphibious Infantry Company. The losses were seen as a great loss, as they had lost comrades trying to capture the major facility, as they had, no doubt, achieved a massive victory in this operation. There would still be more fighting to go, and there would be little time to regroup, as again, the operation was excessively time sensitive, and these troops had to be ready to roll at a moment's notice as it pertained to the Marines. PLAN Marines had to continue to fight. They had to clear the city of Beaumont of all armed combatant resistance forces, all partisan elements, all renegade military escapees that had fled these facilities and were trying to still resist. And also, upon clearing the city, of course, the hinterlands would also need to be cleared, and that would be the job of the Air Assault PLAN Marine Battalion. In the city itself, the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion and Combat Engineer Battalion would be tasked with the clearance operations in this vital node and would achieve it just on time before the arrival of the external invasion prong. Combat Engineer Battalion would be operating in their sector of the city and also cleaning up all resistance. In the next installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth generation warfare, the Combat Engineer Battalion will assault and clear the smaller objective of the sewage and water treatment plant, now occupied by 250 transitory armed reactionary civilians, having had moved into this area, of course, having had been seen by the massive ISR apparatus and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. As a single combat company of the battalion would be tasked with capturing and clearing this facility, the fighting would be still relatively heavy, as the armed reactionary civilians would desperately hurl themselves at the attackers, but to no avail, as the militia forces, still trapped on the other side of a canal in the Beaumont area as the bridges had been taken out by cruise missile strikes, they would emerge from the woods and attack the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion in short order at roughly the same time as the combat engineers would be clearing the general north of the city. More to come in the next video.